So Bree Eller is a team member that's been with us. I think this is her third year since she was a freshman. We have Nelia Holcomb as well, and Nicholas Travado, as well as Noah Brass, and I'm drawing a blank. Oh, and Paige Carter, of course. Sorry, Paige. And thank you for being here today and for your patience as we rescued Noah from purgatory.
Good. Thank you all very much. I want to remind you that this case was written during the summer, and so some of the data that was presented may seem a little outdated now. Who knew we'd still be here at this point? But session 1 is on vaccines. I look forward to the presentations. I have, and it's going to be hard for you to see, I'm afraid, on the virtual background, a bowl with the campus names in it. You're going to have to somewhat trust me. I will draw the first one. It is magic, High Point University. So High Point, if you will begin your presentation, I will give you a verbal signal when there's 1 minute to go. So you may begin now.
Thank you so much, Mr. Brooks.
Oh.
I'm so sorry, we're having a few technical difficulties.
I'll stop the clock while you get those fixed.
Okay, I think we're all good now.
Okay.
Okay. So again, hello, good morning, everybody. Thank you all for being here. To begin, we want to say that it is ethical to place limitations on an individual who did not receive the COVID-19 vaccination. And we have 3 points to make on this. The first one is that the only reliable means to mitigate this pandemic is by using vaccinations. Secondly, the elected public health officials do have authority to implement these guidelines and regulations. And then lastly, the ethicality is predicated on a fair distribution of the vaccine. And so now we have Will to go into that first point.
Hello. As for the first point, we exist in a society, and upon existing in a society, we agree to the social contract therein of that society. This means that we give up some of our rights in order to protect other rights. Now, part of this is this concept of the harm principle, which is essentially the idea that my rights end where another begins, or where someone else's begins. So it is not ethical for me to harm someone in that sense. Now, COVID-19 is a virus. You cannot really control the spread personally, and spreading the virus. Thus, because you cannot control this spread, you have to do everything you can to limit yourself in doing that. Like, for example, there's this concept, the R naught number, which is essentially how likely someone is to give the virus to someone else. If the R naught number is 1, one person will give a virus to another person, just one person, the virus will stay flat. If it's below 1, it takes multiple people for the virus to spread. If the number is above 1, then one person will give the virus to other people. COVID-19, if you take no precautions in order to prevent the spread, the R naught number is at 4. With precautions such as masks and wiping down surfaces and things like that, that number is still at 2. It is spreading. Thus, something needs to be done to get that number lower. That thing that needs to be done is vaccinations, as that way it will prevent you from accidentally harming another person. The next person, Abby, will now go on.
Okay, thank you, William. So I'm going to be discussing how the next leading question is obviously how do we regulate in terms of public health officials, why it is ethical for them to enforce these regulations on people who do not receive the vaccine. It may be clear to some that our individual choices affect not only ourselves, but others, especially in a situation like a pandemic. But when that minority of people becomes the majority who do not understand that, that is when public health officials, we believe, are needed to step in. We would like to reference the United States Supreme Court case Jacobson versus Massachusetts in 1905 for this reasoning. Quote, that adults not under the guardianship and remaining the limits of the city of Cambridge must submit to the regulation adopted by the Board of Health. The court has directly recognized the authority of a state to enact quarantine laws that, quote, health laws for every description, end quote. And this is rightly under the policing power of the Constitution. One might also ask why this is not how this is a violation of one's own liberty. But in this case, we would like to compare it to something like driving on the sidewalk. Yes, you have your own liberty to do that, but in the midst of that, you are going to cause harm to others. And again, we reference the Mill's harm principle for this, which shows us that the only purpose for which power can be rightfully exercised over any member of a community is against his. Thus, is not an argument for restricting harm from individuals against themselves, but in the case of COVID-19, also against others. And that is why we think it is ethical to mandate the vaccination. And we would also like to tie this to Rawls' social contract theory, which discusses that greater restrictions on individuals who willingly choose not to follow COVID-19 guidelines are ethical, because if they are choosing to live in a society where they are abiding by a certain social contract, then it is ethical to regulate it so long as these vaccinations are distributed equitably and freely to all people. And Matt is going to discuss why this is also an important point to discuss the equitability of our healthcare system.
For the question of whether we try to have any sort of legal ramifications, any sort of compulsion by the state for having vaccinations, we have to ask, what are the circumstances under which that would need to arise? Because consider how right now there is a lack of supply of vaccines, a lack of distribution of them. We can't limit people in any way when they don't have access to it. So first off, we have to make sure that there's sufficient supply of the vaccine. Is there enough to go around? Because if there isn't, then honestly, it's fine if people who don't want to get it want to deprioritize themselves, and other people who do want to get it ahead of them. That's fine, because there is enough supply. If there is, and people who want it can get it, that's when we have to start to face the question of whether we try to implement any sort of restrictions. And I don't think people are unreasonable for having concerns. You know, if they didn't live through polio, if they're from a community that, maybe an African-American community where there's a history of the Tuskegee trials where people were treated like lab rats. If they didn't get like a medical degree themselves to understand how mRNA works, like it's all understandable to have some sort of apprehensions for this. And if we were to try to set up restrictions such that, if we were to say like, oh, Bronx, you're first, every single person in your community has to get vaccinated, that would be almost like a lab rat scenario. It makes sense that if people have apprehensions, to allow them to deprioritize themselves, we can distribute it as efficiently as possible for people who want it. And then once that's satisfied, we can start to have businesses and institutions start to set up rules themselves for whether our employees need to have it. We can have schools decide if they think their students need to have it. And then finally, that's when the state can start to step in to check, all right, have we handled the pandemic? Then are we going to implement things beyond that? There are a lot of steps before we do that.
So again, just to reiterate one last time, that one must have access to the vaccine. One must have a reasonable understanding that vaccinating themselves does reduce the harm to the overall community in order for limitations to be ethical. Thank you. Thank you all so much.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Okay, we'll have another presentation, and I will draw. And it is Johnson C. Smith University. So if you will take the microphone, please.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. My name is Brandy. First, this is a great question, not cut dry where there's a decisive yes or no that will suffice. In response to, is it ethical to place limitations on people who have not been vaccinated for COVID-19? We as a team have concluded that there must be limitations, especially for regular communal spaces at schools, sports, gatherings, and offices. But there's also an opportunity for personal responsibility in entities catering to specific audiences that are not labeled as essential. This includes social and recreational functions. We must consider that America is in a vulnerable position. Communities are suffering socioeconomically, as Mr. Sprayberry alluded to earlier. There's a broad gap between the affluent and the lower class, and incomes among the minorities are inadequate for minimal needs. There's also communities being underrepresented in critical conversations where they are being pertained to. There's also disproportionality of healthcare accessibility. The difference between the C-suite or the corporate America and other jobs in healthcare is simply healthcare benefits. History also demonstrates mistreatment causing distrust between the American people and their governments, such as the Tuskegee 400, when people were being tested with syphilis and whatnot, but they're being told that they're getting treated. So they can't explain a wart here or a wart there. This is the home of the free and the land of the brave, and Americans deserve to choose and have the power of personal responsibility. In spaces such as stores, concerts, or parties, guest presence is not a necessity. Therefore, the individual is choosing to go, so they must assume all consequences. Management and the personnel should also decide the procedures for who they allow to service. However, in environments including institutions, competitive sports, and public transportation in which general population occupy, vaccinations are vital. So despite the mistrust and despite inequity, this is a situation in which American cannot afford for their most vulnerable citizens to be exposed or compromised. We want to continue with current procedures in America, acknowledge in education, and establish regulations for other inevitable sectors because we view this as a required immunization and do not categorize it with the lenient. Deja?
Thank you, Brandy. From an ethical perspective, we believe that right is right and wrong is wrong. In this case, we believe that certain ethics depends on the situation or circumstance. In circumstances such as concerts, sporting events, and flying airlines, limitations are unethical and would be impossible to regulate. People have more of a personal responsibility to ensure their health in these circumstances. Whereas in schools and the workplace, limitations are ethical. We believe that across the school board, vaccinations are required in order to protect the teachers and the students from the coronavirus. Also, in a workplace such as hospitals and doctors' offices, nurses and doctors are required to take the vaccine to protect themselves from the coronavirus, especially if someone, like a patient, has coronavirus, because they are risking their lives to save those who have the coronavirus. With that in mind, limitations should be required in circumstances. Kofi?
Going over what colleagues have said, I wholeheartedly agree. And as an individual who is choosing to not take the vaccine, I believe that limitations should be placed on individuals who have not been vaccinated. So, as an individual, once again, that is choosing to not take the vaccine, I understand that my university may decide that students who have not taken the vaccine may not be allowed to attend on campus. And I am fully prepared for the consequences of not taking the vaccine. In addition to not having the documentation for taking the vaccine, I understand that I may be putting myself at risk, but I also may be putting others at risk. Sometimes you may have to look at it as selflessness or selfishness. And in the process of doing that, you have to be selfless. In addition to that, I also understand that by not taking the vaccine, I'm putting others at risk. So even if I take all the precautionary needs to keep myself safe, it would be best if I wasn't on campus in the event that something like this were to occur. In addition to that, one needs to understand that the greater good, one needs to understand the greater good, and it should be in everyone's interest to take the vaccine, in my opinion. But in addition to that, it should be in everybody's interest to keep others safe. Jordan?
Thank you, Kofi. Overall, this all boils down to choice. If an individual decides not to get the COVID-19 vaccination, then an establishment such as restaurants has the right to refuse to serve or accommodate them. For example, When a child is signed up for school, the child's immunization record is a requirement for them to be enrolled. It's the exact same concept. After everything that I have personally missed out on with me being a track and field student athlete, I feel as though if a vaccination is required of me to participate, then I have an important choice to make. My scholarships and eligibility were put at risk and almost stripped away from me, so I know exactly how difficult this decision can be. Although the counterargument is that these possible limitations are stripping people of their rights, the main agenda is safety and equitability. Selflessness is an important attribute to have during times like these. In order to keep the citizens safe in the United States and put an end to this pandemic, every socioeconomic class needs to have access to the vaccine, and depending on their community's future guidelines, make a sound decision. To be clear, we believe that citizens have a choice about the vaccination, yet, when it comes to situations like schooling, the COVID-19 vaccine needs to be put into the same categories as measles and mumps and not categorized like the flu in order to reopen universities and institutions safely. Thank you.
Is there another presenter for Johnson C. Smith, or does that conclude?
That's it.
That's it. Thank you very much. It was very interesting. Okay, I think it's probably superfluous to draw this time, but just to show you that there were 3 in the hat, it's time now for Catawba College. If you will come forward and make your presentation, please.
Hi there, my name is Paige. First, before we would like to talk about the question, we just want to say thank you to the NCICU, especially those who helped organize this event, and especially like the other teams and the sponsors, and of course our moderators and judges. So when looking at the question, is it ethical to place limitations on those who have not been vaccinated for COVID-19? Our team came to the conclusion that if the COVID-19 vaccine is readily available and there are no boundaries to obtaining the vaccine, then it is ethically correct to institute limitations on those who willingly choose not to be vaccinated. And this is said, of course, while keeping in mind medical exceptions and things such as that. So next, I'm going to turn it over to Nelia, who is going to expand upon our answer.
All right. So like Paige said, Catawba College's stance on if it is ethical to place limitations on those who don't take the vaccine, believe it is ethical to do so as long as a sufficient amount of vaccine are available to all members of society. And to support this argument, we will be using the utilitarian theory. The dominant strain of consequentialist ethics can be summarized as the ethical action is the one which provides the greatest amount of happiness or least amount of its absence, the greatest number of people. As physical health or well-being is essential to happiness, higher rates of vaccination would lead to fewer severely ill individuals, fewer deaths, and a return to more typical pre-pandemic lives and economic activity. While there are some individuals who would claim injury to being forced to get the vaccine, the number of the individuals claiming harm and the real magnitude of harm is much lower than the harm caused by low vaccination rates. Additionally, these people are given the choice with full knowledge of the restrictions placed on them should they not vaccinate. These anti-vaxxers would also put a risk to those who cannot receive the vaccine for health reasons and who are at high risk of complications should they catch COVID and do not have this luxury. And I will turn it over to Noah.
Thank you. So like she said, we kind of look at it as a general cost benefit analysis. So given that there's going to be people with medical exemptions and given that there's people that are going to be at risk, like she said, being that as long as everybody can get the vaccine and there aren't economic barriers to getting the vaccine, it becomes a choice of, it becomes more than just personal choice. You're dealing with decisions that are going to affect other people in the communities. So if you can readily get the vaccine and if it's economically viable for everybody to get the vaccine, we think it is morally responsible to put restrictions on certain things. And so what we're talking about is things like public schools, transportation, things where you run a really big risk of putting people at danger if you don't have a lot of vaccination. And then things like restaurants and smaller things, that's kind of up to the business owner. But you're looking at something that's already in place. Like Johnson C. Smith pointed out, like you already have requirements to get into public schools for other vaccines, and this kind of just needs to be added to that, because without everybody getting vaccinated, you're still running huge risks to the community. And really the only way to mitigate the spread of this long term is to have a high level of vaccination in the population. So I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Brianna.
Thank you. One of the big points that I'm going to bring up is about anti-vaxxers. So as a science major in both biology and environmental science, this is something that we heavily had to learn about. And one of the big issues was back a few years ago, a lot of people believed that anything in vaccines was causing autism or other health disorders and mental disorders. Well, it caused certain diseases that had nearly been eradicated here in the US to start appearing again. We could face the same issue with COVID. So with other vaccines, there are religious and health reasons they're not being given. But if you go over to the COVID vaccine, there could be health reasons, but at this point, we've seen what it does to masses. We've seen what it's done to the world. And it comes down to a point where a person has to stop and think, is it really okay for me to put everyone at risk? And that's also something that travel is going to have to change from. I'm actually an environmental major that was planning to travel overseas this summer, but with COVID, that was halted. There's actually talk of implicating systems like the public schools where you will have to show vaccine records before coming into certain countries. And this could be a real change we face in the near future. But I would like to reiterate that we do take the stance using consequentialist ethics that it is it is a person's moral responsibility to get the vaccine, and that it is ethical to limit those who do not. And with that, I'd like to conclude our time. You're muted, sir.
It's hard to talk when you're muted. Thank you. Those were three very interesting conversations, and I enjoyed them. I'd like to open the floor for discussion. And we have about 15 minutes for discussion because we only had 3 teams instead of 4. So assuming we get back into the main room on time and then come back to our next breakout rooms, we're advantaged over some of the others. Let me ask first for any guests who are prior judges or moderators or sponsors, if you have some comments. You may want to go ahead and turn your view back to gallery view so we can see everybody. I think we have a couple of guests here. Do you have any comments to make?
Steve, this is Jack Frost. I would just like to compliment all of you. First, on the challenge of doing this in this format. It's not easy to talk to I guess 16 or 20 or whatever it is people on a screen, and you all did a very professional job of doing that. Second, you obviously put a lot of thought, all 3 teams, into your presentation. And this is one of those issues, which is what the Ethics Bowl is designed to explore, where there can be answers on both sides that are supportable. And I think you all did a very good job. And I say this, I've done this a number of years, but the way you think about this and the way that you have approached your thought process makes us all feel good about the future. So well done, you guys.
Thanks, Jack. I would agree with everything you said. I've been doing this for 10 years myself, and it's always interesting to see how people approach this. Any other comments from guests or sponsors? Well, let's open it up to the teams and coordinators for some conversation about this. I don't think we need to go into the hand raising. Okay, Josiah, I do see your hand up, so we'll call on you.
Thank you. So I had a question, and one thing that we all really stressed was fair distribution and equitable distribution of the vaccine. So the question that I'm posing to the two other teams is, how do you deal with placing limitations on individuals that have not received the COVID vaccine and also have not had access to the vaccine?
I can respond to that. Thank you, Josiah, I think is her name. So I would just say, how can you place a limitation on someone if they don't have access to even be limited? So it's almost as if you're not placing a limitation at all because it doesn't apply to them. This is the same as saying, well, you can eat certain things if on a diet, but let's just say I'm not even on that diet because I don't have the money to even pay for this amount of food. So it's also what you see inequality when it comes to minorities who eat McDonald's versus going to Whole Foods. It's the same thing here. So as Mr. Strayberry said earlier about having accessibility to testing, he made it free to everyone. But with vaccinations, you don't have that same occurrence going on. You see now that healthcare goes into play, but as I mentioned, jobs is a very big thing when it comes to healthcare. You have jobs that include the 401k and include healthcare benefits, but you also have jobs that are paying hour to hour or having hour wages, and they're not including healthcare. And so healthcare is one of those things that's not a priority for them. They're just not going to the hospital. They're dealing with things in-house and just trying to get by. So it's almost as if you can't place a limitation on someone who it doesn't apply to them.
Yeah, so for us, we viewed it really as like a contingent decision. So everything that we gave you and we said our position on was contingent on the fact of two things: one, enough supply, and two, that there's no economic barriers. So if there is an economic barrier, you're systematically making it difficult for lower income people to get it. And then obviously, if it's not supply, you don't have enough of it. So our response is that kind of in the event that you don't meet that contingency, it's no longer ethical to put a restriction on it because you're kind of depending on what the restriction is, whether it's supply or whether it's an economic constraint, you're systematically disadvantaging a section of the population. So like right now in the current environment, absolutely it would be unethical to place restrictions on people. But if at some time in the future we can get to a point where, hey, it's readily available, you can go to CVS, Walgreens, and get it for free. If that's the kind of environment that we're in, and we've been in it for a long enough time that you could reasonably expect somebody to be able to have already gone and done that, that's kind of when it's acceptable for that to kick in, where it's like, okay, we can put restrictions now.
And to comment further on that, we are practicing that, and within in order to place restrictions, certain restrictions can be enforced if you do not have access. For example, we have a Madagascar trip that happens here, and that looks like it's going to be canceled because students are not able to access the COVID vaccination, and it is not fair for us to be going to another country and be potentially spreading COVID to the local population.
I would like to address that. I actually do think every single group did say something about the circumstances under which restrictions could be addressed. So yeah, I do think that every single group did touch on that at some point.
Brianna, did you have a comment?
I was actually going to add on to what Nick was talking about. We also, even before COVID, had to have a certain number of vaccines before we were able to travel to this country. And a lot of places actually have that. When you go to the embassy there, you have to have a certain set of vaccinations before you are allowed in the country. And it's not necessarily saying, like, for instance, if you go to Eastern Africa, it's not necessarily malaria that you have to have, it's recommended, but you are going to, I think you are required to have a tetanus shot and like a series of rounds of shots that protect you, because the country itself knows these are dangers in the environment. So it is something that is very possible for them to add COVID onto it. But that's about all I was going to add to Nick's statement.
I've got a question. So I think we all talked about how we wanted to make sure that the vaccine got out. Like, we can't place restrictions unless people have access to it. And I think to some extent we all thought that, like, you know, if you don't really like have access to it, this doesn't apply to you. And you know, access might take a while to get. But what if we have a situation where it's like, I don't know, like 50% of people really, really don't want to get it? That becomes really concerning, because like, how do you have like a lot of institutions function if you have that many people declining to have the vaccine? Sorry, what? Oh, but yeah, no, I get concerned about how big that share of people could be, because if it's only like 10 or 20% of people who don't want to get it, it becomes more realistic for being able to exclude them in some way. I feel bad in saying that. But as that number gets bigger and bigger, it becomes more and more impractical, and I don't know what to do there.
But I think you start dealing with like a different set of issues if you're approaching a large number of, like, if you're approaching a large percentage of the population that doesn't want to get it. You know, the question becomes a lot larger than, is it ethical to place a restriction? You know, the question really becomes like, why are people not getting the vaccine? And then that becomes really kind of a problem encapsulated in itself. And so, like, a question that I was going to ask to Kofi, because I got a lot of my friends who essentially are refusing to get the vaccine. I try to talk to them. They're like, look, like, if you get the vaccine and everything goes well, then maybe I'll get the vaccine, but I need to see somebody in person do it. And so, like, that kind of becomes the question for me, is how do we as a society set up a system where we can develop trust in communities that don't want to get the vaccine, to where we can get that kind of commitment to it? Because yeah, like, that's something that we talked about as a group kind of behind closed doors a lot, was like, look, like, there are some legitimate concerns out there, maybe not legitimate scientific concerns about the specific vaccine, but if you have that low level of trust in society, like, that becomes a big problem in and of itself.
In response to what you're saying, what I think we could do is explain the science behind it a little bit more. But me personally not wanting to take it, it is a little bit, it's a little bit of fear. In addition to that, I understand you can't trust everything you see on the news or social media, but it's just the fact that there were few people who claimed to have issues. There were the fake cases where people were just exaggerating, but then there were the real cases where people may have developed certain things or their health was put at risk. Even me myself, I do have family members who are doctors and outside friends who are, whose parents are doctors, who have said they've taken it, they've experienced a little bit of nausea, a little bit of headaches, but afterwards they're fine. My worry is just that it may grow into something else. But me personally, I feel like if you can not only explain the science behind it, but can give a detailed explanation as to how it is more beneficial, other than, oh, it'll protect you from COVID, then I feel like I am more likely to take it, and many more people in the country will be willing to do the same thing.
Yeah, and I can definitely agree with that. Because I've actually personally already had my first vaccine shot. And the only thing I had was I was tired for like a week, and that was about it. Was my mom particularly happy about me taking the first round? No. But you know, it comes around to that, like, making sure you can prove the science that this is going to be good for the long run, and proving that this is a good idea for all citizens, and so that more people are our age who are very much questioning the science of it, as well as the older generations who, you know, have lots of questions. So I think that's the biggest thing, is just making sure you can prove the science and be like, this is what's in it. This is why it's good for you. And this is why, you know, we can be, you know, back to pre-pandemic, let's say the next 2 years, 3 years, to make sure that we are covered so that we don't have a spread like this again.
And to add on what Neely is saying, coming from the sciences myself, even though I'm more in environmental science, we're not very good at explaining science to people that don't do science. So that becomes that problem there that Noah was talking about, that becomes another issue, that we need to be able to explain science to large groups of people that don't necessarily have a bachelor's, master's, or PhD in this, because some of the stuff I'm still learning about still blows my mind and I don't understand it. So that becomes an issue of we need to teach science in a way that everybody can understand it.
I'd like to say something on that as well. Just to go back to what Matthew said, can anybody hear me? Okay, so you can hear me?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Just to go back to what Matthew was saying in the question, when he was talking about a large percentage of the population not being willing to take the vaccine, I think in some ways we can compare that to times like back in April when we first were seeing people needing to wear masks out in the public, especially over the summer when we were opening up more. I think we had a large population of people in America that were unwilling to wear masks, and we still set in place rules during that time that said if you cannot enter a restaurant, you cannot enter the doctor's office, any public place without a mask. Even though we had a large percentage of people who were unwilling to wear them, they still had to follow the rules, or they were limited of where they could go without a mask. I think even if there's a large population, you still have to set rules. If, again, like we said in our answer, you have the ability to obtain the vaccine, then it is ethically correct.
And to add to that as well, I think we're going to see a lot of those people wind up getting the vaccine. This example of this being my father works at a car lot in Mannheim, and that's a huge chain. They're all over the place, and there are a lot of people there that do not take COVID seriously. I've worked in that car lot a few times. I don't think I've ever seen anyone wearing a mask through this time. And they're going to be offering everyone there the COVID vaccination for free. And if you do not take it, they will ask you to work somewhere else. And that's going to result in a bunch of people that have not been taking that have not been taking COVID seriously. It's going to make them get the vaccine.
Jump on real quick and make a point. I completely agree that there's such a discrepancy in scientific communication, especially in terms of vaccinations and other discoveries, because it's hard to talk about things that we can't see, that we can't really show people. And I personally have received both doses of the COVID vaccine, and the only symptom and side effect I experienced was soreness in my arm. And I think one of the reasons for promoting widespread distribution is that we don't know the long-term implications of having COVID-19. But there are a few preliminary studies from the Mayo Clinic, National Institute of Health, that have shown there are long-term significant problems and damages to the heart, the cardiovascular system, the circulatory system, deterioration of the arteries and veins, leading to an increased risk of stroke and other diseases like that. So I think it's completely valid, because in today's society, we're inundated with all of this information, irrespective of whether it's true or false, on all of the news organizations. Oh, breakout room is about to close. But that starts with effective communication, just like we heard from the speaker.
This has been a great discussion. I just got the word that will be thrown out.
Should I say?
Welcome back, everyone. Sounds like the process has worked. I hope everyone had success in their breakout room. We had at first a little bit of difficulty getting some of our team members in, but that was accomplished, and we had some fascinating presentations and good discussion at the end. So I hope all of you were able to do that as well. I'm going to ask you now to take a little break. I'm sure you all need it, especially our team members. We will be coming back since we came out of our breakout rooms at 10:58. Rebecca is on it. So at 11:13, we will come back to this room to talk about the second round beginning at 11:15, which is why you need to be back by 11:13. So you're welcome to go off camera and to mute your microphone, and we'll see you back here in just a minute.
Hope, if I may, this is
Yes,
Rebecca.
please.
I'd like to make an announcement to help more seamlessly move everyone for our next round. We have just a reminder of the teams for session 2, and we have provided the option for you to move yourself into your room that you're assigned to. So if I may just make an announcement of those teams so that they will know, just be reminded of where they might choose to go next time to help us more quickly move everyone who doesn't have a Zoom account in the pre-assignment. And so let me announce that clearly, hopefully. Gardner-Webb University, Pfeiffer University, and William Peace University, you are in breakout room number 1 for the second session. Breakout room number 2, Belmont Abbey, Johnson C. Smith, St. Augustine's University, and Salem College. Breakout room 2. Breakout room 3, Catawba College, Mars Hill University, Montreat College, University of Mount Olive. And finally, breakout number 4, Chowan University, High Point University, Meredith College, North Carolina Wesleyan College. And if you are one of our honored guests, a judge, moderator from prior years, and or a sponsor, you will remain in the same room in which you began in the first session. So I just want to offer that in case helpful when we get ready to start reassigning everyone for session 2. Thank you.